Today on the Everything 80s podcast, the story of Tetris, the most addicting video game ever. Hey, how are you? What's happening? Welcome back to the Everything 80s podcast. I'm Jamie. Thanks for coming on out today. And we're looking at the video game that helped launch the Game Boy and one of the best-selling games in history and one of the most addicting video games ever made, Tetris. So we're going to look back on the whole story, how it was developed, how it got more popular, it spread its influence, all that good stuff. Before we start, however, if you haven't already, subscribe wherever you find your podcast. I should be there, whether it's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, iHeart, all that stuff. I should be there. Okay, let's do this. So like I said, even though, Mario and Super Mario Brothers are the kings of all video games, Tetris is a very close second and probably even more addicting. And in case this is new to you, the quick summary is Tetris is a tile matching video game. It came out in 1984. It was designed by a Russian game designer. And as you know, or hopefully know, it involves combining four different four-piece blocks to create solid lines. So each line erases itself and drops down, and you can continue to play. So I don't know if you remember specifically when Tetris came out. I remember the hype behind it very well. And over the years, how that continued to grow. It was so simple, but so addicting. And I think that's always the secret behind a lot of successful games. If you look back on some of the, say, arcade games and Atari games from the 80s, I mean, they're so crude in their design and there's nothing to it. There's no real, they didn't have the technology or really capacity to create good imagery. So you're often just playing with little blocks and cubes. But if the gameplay is smart and creative, that's what makes it compelling and you wanted to keep playing it. Like they're actually a real challenge, and that's the idea behind Tetris. And it created this sort of phenomenon where, people, I remember myself included, you'd start to see like Tetris blocks everywhere. And when you weren't, if you were in school or in class, your mind would start going to thinking of trying to connect patterns. Like it could really actually ingrain in your head. And I remember specifically like sitting in a math class and then having Tetris automatically playing in my head. And I was like, whoa. And then realizing I'm not the only one who feels that way, because people around the world were kind of succumb to this like new experience where they were taking something they were playing in the handheld form and it was sticking in their head. I mean, Tetris sold 170 million copies, and that beats like big time games from today still, like Minecraft or Grand Theft Auto or all that stuff. So we'll look back at how Tetris really came out of the Cold War to start and how it would end up dominating the video game world. So the Cold War is still raging in the former USSR, and an engineer named Alexei Pajitnov was working at the Soviet Academy of Sciences in Moscow. So he loved a game called Tetrominoes. That's a harder one to say. Tetrominoes, which involved putting a bunch of geometric shapes in a rectangle without leaving any spaces. Tetrominoes has been around for quite a while. It goes back to the early 1900s, was very popular with mathematicians. He wondered if this is something that would transfer over into a computer game and sought out one of his colleagues. With help from a guy named Dmitry Pavlovsky, they came up with a rudimentary computer game using super basic graphics that also didn't have any sound to it. It was developed and played on an Electronica 60, and due to the limited computing power, they had to use text characters, so each shape was made up of text letters. The problem was, even if you were combining lines together and making everything fit, the screen was filling up too quickly. This is when they came up with the feature that would enable the great gameplay of Tetris. The completed lines would be deleted. So looking at the early gameplay, they've taken this concept of Tetronymos and added the function of gravity, which would introduce the shapes from the top of the screen and allow them to fall to the bottom. Like I have to tell you this in case you've never played Tetris, but They decided another massive step in this whole thing was deciding to go with just 4 shapes, each made up of 4 blocks. And this is what really differentiated the game from Tetronymos. You'll have to do a Google search and you can see what Tetronymos look like, and you can see how the influences definitely came from that. So as the levels passed, the shapes would fall at increasingly faster speeds, making the challenge grow as the game did, which was different from a game such as, say, Pac-Man, which always had the same speed and intensity no matter what level you were on. So you had to make lines and clear them, and it seemed very simple, but it was also very addicting. They felt they had something unique and potentially a hit on their hands, so what were they going to call it? Alexei actually took the name Tetronymos, which seems obvious, but combined it with his favorite sport, tennis, to combine into Tetris, which sounds extremely made up, but that was the true story behind the name. So now they need to start producing Tetris. So they would Tetris would be ported over to the IBM PC, and they were able to start sharing it around on gigantic old floppy disks. If you're under 30 and you don't know what a floppy disk is, you're going to have to either ask your parents or look it up. But this new game was now shared, and it was shareable to different people. And where they worked in the USSR, there was a giant computer center, and they shared it all around that, and the people in there ate it up big time. It seemed too simple to these people to be engaging, but they found themselves unable to stop. It was getting so bad that they were starting to neglect their work as they were too caught up in Tetris. You can almost hear the cash register sounds starting to ring. So this is now in the summer of 1985, and then a color version of Tetris was created. This is what spread like wildfire throughout Moscow. Somehow, Tetris made its way to Budapest, Hungary, where a British software company came across it. I think it was in some sort of street market, and almost like very Indiana Jones-ish, where you discover all great artifacts. But they basically came across it sort of by chance in one of these places. But here's some, Russian red tape at the time. Since Pajitnov was working for the Soviet government, his intellectual property was owned by the state. So I'll assume Nikolai Volkov's former WWF bear hug finisher was probably owned by them too. But the crazy thing is, none of them had thought that this could be a product that could actually be sold because, again, it seemed way too simple. They thought it was just something to pass around amongst friends, and they had no idea the thing had spread as far as it did, as far as to Budapest, and then, people from Britain getting a hold of the thing. Due to the Soviet government owning the intellectual property, it would end up really screwing the creator of Tetris out of money for years and years, which we'll get to in a bit. So here comes the inevitable battle over Tetris. So Tetris became at the center of a rights war between the Soviet government's foreign trade organization and then a bunch of different Western companies. During all these battles, the U.S. basically said screw it and released a very unofficial version of Tetris. Actually, it would be questionably official at best, but whatever, the ways they seem to describe it and kind of worked around the red tape, they got it out there. That's the main thing. They put it out in 1986, and Tetris would be the very first Soviet game to ever be introduced to American audiences. The intrigue and the controversy that was happening at the same time, that didn't hurt at all for Tetris. And this is still a time when anything to do with Russia was making people nervous. So they were kind of able to market this game as being a secret Russian invention, and it had been, kept behind the Iron Curtain and worked on secretively and all this sort of stuff. So, and that was a compelling enough reason for people to check this game out. The other big thing is no one had really seen a game like it before. It had only been a few years since the video game resurgence that was happening after the video game crash of 1983. So most games that were coming out at the time were still very cartoony or very shooter style, which was the direction most the game designers went with. Tetris was something completely different. Video games tend to be chaotic and thoughtless now, especially if you've seen them involved, and you're basically no disrespect to modern games, but it's essentially like you're watching a movie and then being involved in it, so you can kind of just turn your mind off and go with it. But Tetris required order. It required patience. It required thinking and quick thinking and problem solving and decision making. All the things I personally lacked in the 80s. But like everyone else who played Tetris, it became immediately addictive and a huge hit. It takes like 10 seconds to figure out actually how it works. So there's sort of a low barrier to entry. I think a big part of it is not just that, but overall it has a fast learning curve. Whether you are like a little kid or a senior citizen, it doesn't take too much trial and error to understand the gameplay, and you can immediately be good at it. That's a huge selling point for any successful game. You're not going to be frustrated and give up on the first level. You're going to do well on the first level, and that's going to motivate you, encourage you to keep going with it. So, that's making it extremely successful when it came out, but no one actually still had the rights to the game. So now we look at winning the Tetris battle. So companies are going back and forth with the Soviets for years trying to secure the rights. This included Atari, who you think would have been able to pull it off, but they didn't. So incredibly, they went to Nintendo, and Nintendo secured the rights for Tetris in 1989. The NES was now a big and established hit, and they would bundle Tetris in with various box sets. They also would use it in a new gaming console, which would be responsible for launching Tetris into the stratosphere. That, of course, was the Game Boy. There was some hesitation around the Game Boy, again, which seems funny looking back, but it was thought that including Tetris would help the Game Boy appeal to a wider audience. The Game Boy version of Tetris would go back to its roots using grayscaled graphics and Russian-influenced music, which would end up becoming a pretty iconic part of the game. I don't know if you remember like playing that Game Boy version of Tetris and not knowing necessarily the backstory. Like, unless you were deep into video games, we had no idea that this was a kind of rights war between the Soviet Union and America and the West, and that it was it was being controlled by the state. And so we had no idea, but like, it kind of seemed funny that we were playing this game that had this Soviet Russian influence and this specific music and the imagery, but whatever, we just knew it was awesome. That version of Tetris that you played on the Game Boy would be the closest to Pajitnov's original version for the game. And so this is, Tetris is everywhere. You probably remember the commercials. He still wasn't getting paid. It wouldn't be until 1996 that he would start receiving money for the game he created, more than a decade before. So let's look at what I mentioned before, which was called the Tetris Effect. Remember I mentioned about thinking about seeing Tetris everywhere and it happening in your mind like that? This was an actual very real thing and a very real effect that hit a lot of people. It would actually take scientific study to identify this and deem it the Tetris effect, which was caused by prolonged play. It caused us to see the real world like it was a game of Tetris. You would start seeing everyday objects in creations and structures in means of how they would fit together, and it was actually classified as a form of hallucination. It did have one positive effect, however, and it was seen as effective for people who were dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. There was something about the order and focus required by Tetris that could help with people who were suffering from PTSD. It allowed for this to direct your mind onto more of a different sense of problem solving, and again, the structure and the organization. And that brings us to, the legacy, the long-lasting legacy of the game of Tetris. It's, again, I'm not sure many people know the whole story behind how this game was developed. And again, it's the story of one of those simple things, a simple idea that can and has appealed to everyone. You don't have to be good at video games to play it, and you don't even necessarily have to like video games to enjoy it. It's something that is almost like a creative, mind practice that allows you to use that part of your brain that's maybe not engaged as often, which is like kind of calling out to be used. And Tetris appealed to a lot of people. Like, I remember people who like parents, friends and stuff who had no interest in video games, but they had a Game Boy and they had Tetris because they knew it was like able to activate their mind, and it was able to help them with, problem solving, and they could focus, and it was like a kind of a mental output that they weren't getting from anything else. So it is a universal game, and it truly has gone worldwide. There are so many versions and iterations of Tetris that we would be here for days if we listed them all. And because of how no one was able to technically secure down the rights, Tetris is available for every video game system pretty much that's ever been created since it came out. You probably have a version on your phone like I do. I think I have 2 different ones. It's available in every app store, for every phone, for every device. You can get it on any tablet in any version of phone that basically exists. So as great and advanced as video games have become, there's something about simple gameplay again that still draws people in. Maybe it's the fact that you can never win it. It's impossible to beat, and maybe that's what makes it more intriguing. Every time you start a new game, you feel like this could be the best round you've ever played. And if you didn't think that, you would never have picked it up again after that first round. There's something that draws you in to try to succeed more, to try to overcome, to always like beat your best score. It's like why racing games are so popular. Every round has new promise that this is going to be the best one you've ever done. It draws you in and it leaves you wanting more. Every game you lose, think about any time you've played Tetris, whether you're a kid or older, every time you lose, you think, I won't let that happen again. The next round is going to be different. And that's at the core of any great video game that's truly, truly addictive. So that's a look back on Tetris. It's, one of the defining video games of the 80s. It's what helped launch the Game Boy, and it helped take Nintendo to the next level. So hopefully you learned some interesting stuff here today, and you'll be reminded to go back and download it again and play it on whatever device you like, because it will be there. So thank you for taking the time to listen to the show. Again, if you haven't already, subscribe wherever you find your podcast. I should be there. If you really like it, leave it a rating and review. That way more people get to see it. But thank you for spending the time with me. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.